Hello, students. This is your professor for English 231, Ann Babson. I have chosen to make this video for you in lieu of a class meeting because I have been told that I have to quarantine again. The vaccine study saw something that I guess alarmed them in my symptoms and my blood. And as you see, I'm not at death's door, but they've asked me to do not one but two COVID tests and to stay away from you, which is not the worst thing that's ever happened to you, that I would stay away from you so that you wouldn't get a horrible disease. I want to talk to you about our reading of Octoroon and the Mikado. I have chosen to give you both of these performance works. One's an operetta. The Mikado is a marvelous operetta. And the other one is not the greatest play, but it's set in Louisiana by an author who was part of the British Empire. And it's a very strange commentary on race. In both cases. Octoroon is the melodramatic tragedy of a woman who is supposed to be an heiress to a plantation in Louisiana, and she is in love with a man. She is thought of as white, but when it is discovered that she is 1/8 black, the marriage is not allowed. Octoroon means a person in that time would have been called that who was 1/8 black. And it's all very hand to forehead melodrama. And it's a very strange conversation about race and identity. No one questions the absurdity of a law in the play that would not allow someone who was 100% black marrying someone who was 100% white. That's a given in this environment. There is a lot of racist discourse embedded in this text. And of course, I do not give this to you as something to read in order to make you think that I agree with the writer any more than if I give you, we're going to read later on the Screwtape Letters, which is about the dialogue between two demons. And I'm not on the side of the demons either. Neither am I on the side of racist Louisiana. But it is worth discussing this because at the time it seemed to suggest that humanity was more complex. You will recall that Olaudah Equiano has a white wife. He marries a British woman. In his social class, nobody thinks that that's insane. It's the American obsession with race and gradations of race that is put forward, but it is important for you to know something about something. I do research on something called whiteness studies, which is about how white people perceive themselves in relation to other people. That's really what whiteness studies is. And it has to do with the political privileges and systemic racism that occurs. But at a more literary level, it's not necessarily about a political propaganda all the time. It is certainly about things that have nothing to do with the people that are supposed to be the other race than the white race in a work of literature, particularly in the late Victorian era in British literature. There is a psychologist named Alain Gros-Richard who studies stories of race. Particularly, he's interested in what's called Orientalism, which is a study of the reductive view of people from the east of Europe, as close as Turkey and as far away as Japan. and he makes a number of observations. The first is that he does research on the stories of the Turkish harems written by Europeans who are imagining them, and people who claim to have been eyewitnesses of things that actually never happened. So they're essentially fiction. And he takes one writer who is writing in the late 1600s and another one who is writing in the early 1800s, mid 1800s, describing the Turkish harems of the ruler. And he says that they are identical in their portrayal of the women and men in the harem culture, and he says that's not because the culture was somehow fixed in amber and didn't move. It's that it was never a real picture. It has everything to do with what the white person felt looking at the other people who were seen as other than him. And his theory, one that I ascribe to as a scholar, is that racism is the projection of those things that the white people think are unacceptable for them to have as characteristics onto another race of people who absorb them and are then reviled for them. What I would have you take away from that idea is that it's you will recall there was someone in political life not in America who said we needed to build a wall because Mexicans were rapists. Someone who has been accused, credibly, 32 times of sexual assault. Mexicans are rapists. Mexicans are the rapists. I'm not weighing in on any the accusations, but what I am saying is pointing to a brown-skinned person and saying it wasn't me, it was him, is projection potentially. And that's just one small example. There is a repeated trope in literature of the Oriental despot, and we see it in the play Mikado, where the Emperor of Japan was not an insane emperor in real life, but in the Mikado, we imagine him as having crazy laws where he's supposed to put a bunch of people to death. And it's actually comic because no one's ever actually been put to death. But even the people who went to see the Mikado on opening night understood that the portrait it painted of Japan was not a critique of actual Japanese people, but a discussion of living in London at that time. A comic look at life in London. Likewise, the feelings related to race expressed in Octoroon are likely to be a conversation not about slavery and its aftermath in Louisiana, so much as the projection of feelings about Black people by white Europeans onto people with black skin. I give you these to look at, in part because with the distance of more than a century, we see obviously the absurdity, one comic, one tragic, of these narratives that were highly popular. I can't overemphasize how wildly popular both in the United States and in England both of these dramatic works were. I think it allows us, as new projections are sent to us from our social and cultural mindset, we are able to better identify them. It's obvious that Octoroon would be an absurdity to us today, no matter what our feelings about race. It would just not make sense. And the Mikado is obviously fake. It's a story that is everything to do with you might call them the fashion police in London, and nothing to do with an Oriental despot in Japan. And consequently, they are both a portrait of thoughts and sentiments at the time in England of white people, about white people's experience somehow projected onto someone else, because the rules were so strict in England. It was much easier to imagine a despotic brown person, or the tragedy of birth for a brown woman, or maybe even just a brunette who's 1/8 black, than it was to sort of examine one's own feelings about the imperfections in one's own life as a white Victorian who was supposed to be, as previous lectures I have given for this class, superior because he or she was British, hence morally superior, intellectually, naturally superior. The belief that white people were smarter than black people persisted in this time, and I would even say flourished, and was never based on evidence of any credible nature, I assure you. But I want us not to forget this part of our past, and I want us to read this with an eye not to condemn the Victorians, who are all dead without exception, but to keep our eyes open for similar false narratives in our own culture at this time. I actually think these are both enjoyable works if we read them with those kinds of night vision goggles on. I think what we see is what white people were thinking about themselves at this time projected onto other people that were not white, that they imagined, figments of their imagination. This is something that has been addressed literarily by thinkers in the 20th and 21st centuries. Early 21st century poetry in America by Cornelius Eady, a book called Brutal Imagination, is a book about the imaginary black man in American consciousness. It's a marvelous book. It's not within the scope of our discussion of British literature, but I just wanted to show you this so that you can see things today. And honestly, I think that you will find a kind of pleasure when you understand it in in a proper psychological frame to know what was really going on. It allows you to say, oh, they were racist and they were saying these things because they couldn't accept all kinds of things about themselves. So I tell you this so that you will understand that I am in no way a promoter of the racism represented in these works of literature, but I am not afraid to look at things. You got a lecture from me about anti-Semitism earlier this semester in 18th century restoration comedy, and here we are again in theatrical performance, another work that is ultimately an enactment, kind of like a ventriloquism of the Caucasian person's heart through the optic of racism. I'm not the bad one. It's those other people that you can't trust. It's not me. And when you see that, I think that you understand a lot about Victorian society, and you are able to critically examine messages of future dates after the Victorians about and weigh things with a that are set in not just works of literature, but in cultural messages of a variety of kinds, and see how they might be the product of a kind of insecurity in the white population rather than a rational fear of people who are darker skinned. That's what I wanted to tell you about this class's reading at this time. Thanks a lot. Bye.